Well, let's turn to the advisory now and changes in superannuation, including the proposed Division 296 tax on large super balances. Joining us is Scott Montefiore, Wealth Advisor at William Buck. Scott, welcome. Good to have you on AusBiz. Now,
Thank you for having me.
I feel as though I've been talking about this for months. Division 296, of course, has been looming large over super, particularly those on larger balances. Where are we at with that legislation and the potential implications then for those super holders?
Yeah, it seems like it's been going on for a long time, as you mentioned earlier, but the latest update is the government released their draft legislation, and that was just towards the end of December, the last week before everybody went on holidays. And essentially, they've left that open to consultation all the way up until the 16th of January. I believe that consultation's now closed. But there's a few main differences between the legislation when it was first passed and the one that's been is planning to be reintroduced after this consultation phase. The main difference are they've split the Division 296 into two different balances. So the first one is people with balances between $3 million and $10 million. And then there's an additional group who have balances above $10 million. The main difference there is they've altered the taxation rates between those two. Those with a balance between 3 and 10 million will have an additional 15% tax payable on earnings. That's a really big change in what was previously proposed, and it's really important that listeners, don't go and make any rash decisions based on legislation before it's actually passed, because the previous legislation was going to include unrealised capital gains on all sorts of different investments, including properties and farms. That's been watered down quite a bit, and the new legislation is referring to income, so the traditional sense of income within superannuation. For those that have balances above 10 million, they will be charged an additional 10% tax on top of the 15% that they'd be charged for balances between $3 million and $10 million. So particularly for those who have balances above $10 million and significantly above $10 million, there's quite a considerable amount of tax still paid.
All right.
The effective rate on some of that income would be around 40%.
But you're saying don't move yet. Wait until that legislation actually has been written into law before you actually make those changes then.
That's certainly what we've been advising clients, and anyone who reacted to the original advice and made changes, particularly those who are in the between the $3 million and $10 million range. They may have made decisions that they didn't necessarily need to make. So in our firm, we have a lot of clients obviously with balances well in excess of $3 and $10 million, and we always like to see the legislation when it's passed before we make decisions. Even if the legislation's passed today, you still have really until the 1st of July 27 to make changes, because that's the first time the tax would be applied. So there's plenty of time to speak to your professional advisors and get advice around what to do, but there certainly wouldn't be advising people to make any knee-jerk reactions just based on a draft piece of legislation.
Scott, tax is such a huge consideration when it comes to super. More broadly, beyond 296, what do you need to consider, particularly if you're in that accumulation phase? In other words, if you're still working, you're still paying tax, working towards retirement, what do you need to consider in terms of perhaps minimising that tax on your super?
Yeah, well, look, superannuation, the way to think of it is a tax structure. And I guess one of the reasons that they've tried to introduce these higher taxes at the upper end is it's still, for most people who are on particularly the highest tax bracket, it's very favourably taxed in accumulation. So, as you know, you're getting a tax deduction for your first $30,000 that you put in from your employment income. And that's, you're getting a tax deduction on that, even if your income is above $250,000. You're still getting concessionally taxed when that money goes in. But more importantly, when you're in accumulation or working phase, the income tax on any investments that you're earning are only 15%. So, a lot of consideration needs to be put into the type of assets that you're having in super. For a lot of my clients, we're focusing on income producing assets within super. Particularly, even if you break it down to different asset classes, but if we're looking at, direct Australian shares. Quite often within the superannuation environment, I'm advising clients to have income producing shares and, ideally ones that have franking credits attached to it. If you structure your portfolios, like that within super, you can really, really reduce your income tax. The second way to think about it is, if you haven't started with a superannuation strategy in your early years, your 20s and 30s, you really need to get started in your 40s at the latest. There's a lot of talk about these large super balances, but in reality, if you're younger, the current rules, it's quite hard to actually get $3 million into super. You really have to be diligent from an early age in terms of putting your contributions in and building it up. Why would you want to build it up? Well, under current rules, when you retire, you can actually have $2 million in what we call an account-based pension. And in really layman's terms, that means that you can invest that money without income tax, without capital gains tax, and you can pull a salary from that superannuation pension tax-free that's excluded from your personal tax return. So, in terms of tax structures, it is the most amazing structure that I'm aware of anywhere in the world.
Well, when you're talking, beyond tax as well, just in terms of risk and asset allocation, what do you need to consider as you're approaching retirement and then entering beyond that accumulation phase?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One of the interesting things about my career is that I started before the global financial crisis, and one of the things that really sticks out to me, even to this day, when I'm talking to clients, particularly as they get towards retirement phase, is the level of risk that they're taking on within their portfolios. I guess what we're typically advising clients, is if they're going to take more risk, to do it in their earlier years and look to peg back that risk, particularly when they get close to retirement age. So, someone who might be 60 and they're planning on retiring at 65 or 63 or something like that. For a lot of our clients, we're talking about, potentially pegging back the risk a little bit. If you get to a situation where you are quite aggressively invested and the market drops when you're close to retirement, it goes from potentially being quite a nice retirement to quite a stressful retirement. And, one of my observations over the years is those that do that, get the timing right, not through their own fault, but just the timing of their retirement when the market crashes. It can be quite stressful for them, and they can actually need to work a little bit longer to build their balances up and things like that. So typically with clients, it's really a long-term discussion around risk and when to take risk and when to not take risk. But certainly if they're going to readjust a risk strategy, it should be in that period to leading up to retirement.